We all know who Netflix are. We use them every day. They are the dominant player in that industry right now. But just 15 years ago, that wasn't the case. And there was a company called Blockbuster that some of you may remember that were the dominant market leader at that time. Now, fast forward to today, one of those companies, Netflix, is worth over $200 billion. And the other is a museum experience, basically. But just 15 years ago, Blockbuster had 85,000 employees around the world in 9,000 stores. They were doing $6 billion in revenue a year. So how did this happen? How did it happen that there was such disruption and such innovation in a market, and one company, previously the dominant player, failed to innovate, and the other continually innovates and disrupts the market almost on an ongoing basis? So why has that happened, and what's the role that culture plays within that story? So there are two parts to this story that I want to focus on, and the first is late fees. So a late fee in the Blockbuster model was when you, as a customer, walked into a Blockbuster store, picked the title you wanted to watch, took it to the counter, paid for that, and then you took it home to watch, but you had to return it within a certain time frame. And that transaction that you make when you go in and rent that film, that is a contract, and you're saying, I am going to return this film within a certain time frame, and if I don't, I will pay this late fee for every day that I'm late. This was massively successful for Blockbuster, to the extent where they were doing between 15 and 20% of their yearly revenue just from this one part of their contract. And in terms of money, that's roughly around $1 billion a year. And I imagine a very healthy contributor to their profit margin. Now, you might be watching this and wondering, why on earth would people pay a late fee? And it is fascinating from a human behavior perspective. There are three elements that I'll briefly touch on here to explain why. Humans are atrocious at planning. We are massively overconfident, really over-optimistic in what we expect our future selves to be able to do. You can actually test this yourself. So if you sit where you are today and think, right, 7 days from today, 1 week from today, what shall I have for dinner? And you'll probably think of something nutritious, maybe your favorite meal, something that requires some prep time, get the ingredients, etc. Fast forward a week, and on that day that you've planned to have this meal, you've had a busy day at work, kids have gone bonkers, you're tired, it gets to 5:30, 6 o'clock, you're hungry, you're probably just going to throw something in the oven, a pizza or something like that. The funny thing about this planning fallacy is, if you asked yourself again at that exact moment, what are you going to have in the next week's time, you'd make exactly the same mistake again. We are hugely over-optimistic and overconfident in our expectations of our future selves. And the Blockbuster model really played well to that. When we rented that movie, we thought, absolutely, we'll be able to return this on time. But obviously, as shown by the revenue they made from it, we continually failed to do so. Really simply, this is just the fact that humans pay attention to a very small amount of information, and then we try and build a narrative or a story from that information. And we look at the information that's most salient, the one that's in big, bold capital letters, for example. So that's really interesting when you think about terms and conditions. We're probably not going to read the detail in a contract that says you're going to have a late fee or something like that. You're just going to read the headlines and then move on. The third reason from a human behavior perspective, and for me, it's probably the one I'm going to spend the most time on across all the videos that I do, is this thing called market and social norms. These are so powerful from a behavioral science perspective. And if you rewind to the period when Blockbuster were charging late fees and we were accepting them, it was a market norm. There wasn't an equivalent. Blockbuster weren't doing anything wrong. They were just providing a service, and they had a contract that had this late fee in there. There was no other alternative model for the market to go to or for consumers to go to. So therefore we accepted it. They changed the game completely. They had an online platform, they didn't have stores, and the model was that you would rent your movie from the Netflix platform, they would post it to you in the mail, and then you would receive that and return it when you wanted. There wasn't a concept of a late fee. They changed the market norm, and therefore our expectations as customers completely changed, which made the Blockbuster model very, very hard to digest as a consumer when given an alternative. So imagine you're the chief exec at the time of Blockbuster. You're John Antico. You've guided the company through this huge growth through the 90s, and now you're in the early 2000s, and there's this noisy competitor that's disrupting and changing the model and changing how your consumers expect to be provided a service. Now, to be fair to John Antico, he recognized the threat of Netflix. He was famously the person that apparently decided against buying Netflix in the late 90s for something like $50 million. Now, John disputes that. The Netflix book, No Rules Rules, has a different version of that story. We'll never know the truth. But John recognized the threat, and he built a Blockbuster online platform, I think it was called Blockbuster Online, that launched in the early 2000s to compete with this Netflix model. John's idea was, we'll maintain what our strength is, our assets, our stores, our service to the vast array of members that we have, but we'll grow this online platform at the same time to compete with Netflix. We'll see how the internet plays out. The dot-com bubble was around at this point as well. And then we'll see how successful those models will be in the future. Now, for John, that was a really hard battle to fight, because in the company at that time, there were big investors like Carl Icahn, who felt very differently about the future of Blockbuster. Carl made his name as an investor to come into companies and turn them around, turning failing companies around. And his opinion was very different. And he was thinking about, well, our strength is in our stores, so we should really invest in that. We're losing money on this Blockbuster online platform. Let's get rid of it. And that's where culture plays a really key part in innovation and disruption. And there are three major biases that would have been very, very prominent at that time. Now, status quo bias is simply, you want to do what you've always done. It's not scary, it's something you understand, it's the default option, it's the option that you're most familiar with, that you're maybe the most emotionally invested with. So as humans, we have a very natural status quo bias. And if you think about being around those leadership tables in Blockbuster at the time that there was this power struggle between John Antico, the chief exec, wanting to do something different that was losing a lot of money, and then Carl Icahn and his kind of political friends around the table in Blockbuster who were saying, nope, we should go back to what's always worked before, you can see how those discussions would have very natural status quo bias within them. The second is one that's very, very well understood, I think, in business, and that is confirmation bias. We naturally, as humans, look to find information that supports our ideas and that supports our beliefs. And at the same time, we disregard information that's against our ideas, our values, and our beliefs. So putting yourself around those leadership tables and those discussions around, well, what's the right strategy here? You've got Carl and John maybe at two opposing ends of the table, both putting forward their ideas of the future of Blockbuster. And you can imagine that there'd be a lot of confirmation bias happening in those discussions. You know, Carl before a meeting might be saying, right, let's find all the information that shows that the internet.com bubble is an example of what's going to happen in the future. We shouldn't be investing in this online platform. Netflix are losing loads of money. Find me information that supports that. At the same time, John might be looking to find evidence to show the growth in the online platform, how Netflix will be a big power in the future, and how this model is the thing they should invest in. Both parties could probably find lots of information to support their ideas in those discussions. Confirmation bias is a very, very natural human behavior. The third bias that's interesting here is loss aversion. Now, in those discussions around the Blockbuster leadership team tables, you'd have people feeling the loss from that Blockbuster online platform. Up until this point, they'd made billions of dollars each year from their traditional model of stores, etc. But now they've got this part of their business that's losing millions per year with no actual hard evidence of future profit. And so aligning yourself to that idea politically around those meeting tables and leadership team discussions, that is a bit of a risk. And you'd feel that loss aversion when you're thinking, do I want to be aligned to something that is losing that amount of money? Now, outside of a business context, if you think about your own biases as individuals, the empirical evidence shows that we actually feel a loss more than an equivalent gain. What I mean by that is, if you were told, right, you're going to have £100, imagine what that would feel like. And then being told, I'm taking £100 away from you, what that would feel like. We feel the latter much more than the former. Losses way more than gains. So I'm not saying that late fees were the reason why Blockbuster failed. There are many reasons why that happened. But in terms of lessons to be learned from that story and in the context of workplace culture, I think it's fascinating. Because imagine if you were the person around the room in Blockbuster and you're saying, we need to innovate, we need to change, we need to invest in this online model that's going to lose millions for an unknown amount of time. And as part of that, we need to remove late fees as a contractual penalty for our customers. That's huge. I mean, to compete with the Netflix model, they'd have had to have done that. But if you're that individual around that leadership team table, putting your hand up and saying that, you are saying, I'm happy to wipe $1 billion of revenue off of our bottom line from today. So that's why I think culturally this is a really interesting one to learn from. Late fees were hugely successful. Yes, they penalized human behavior, but they were massively successful. And when you've got something like that, that then needs to really shift and change in order to innovate and keep up with the market or disrupt the market, imagine how hard those conversations are to have. Is your culture right to enable those discussions to be had and for good decisions to be made and discussed and debated and challenged? Now, ultimately in Blockbuster, the decision was to go back to the original model. When Carl was successful in his power struggle with John Antico, John left the company, a different chief exec was put in, and they reverted back. They removed the online Blockbuster model. They reintroduced late fees, and they went back to investing in stores. And ultimately now, Blockbuster is a museum experience. So there's a lot to learn about that. But the thing to remember, I think, in a late fees context is if a part of your business is really successful, it might also be holding you back. You need your people to be able to tell you that that's the case, and for fresh and new ideas to be able to come to the fore and to be debated, challenged, discussed, and explored without penalty. The second area that's really interesting about this story is leading with context, not control. So now the focus is on Netflix and what they did really, really well, which is many things within this story. Netflix is a bit of an anomaly if you think about their history. They've shifted the market several times, not just once. When they launched, they were the first online platform to rent DVDs from. That was back in the late 90s. But then in 2007, they then streamed that content. Then they started having exclusive content just on their platform. House of Cards was the first example of that only went onto Netflix. Again, they were the first platform to do that. And then more recently, they're now producing their own shows. Roma, I think, was their best example, early example of that in 2019 when it won 3 Oscars. But they're actually producing their own content now. So they've continually shifted and disrupted the market in a way that Blockbuster failed to do once. I've read the No Rules Rules book, which is Reed Hastings, who's the chief exec of Netflix, co-founder, and co-authored by Erin Meyer. That book is a really good read to understand how they set up their culture in Netflix. And I'll do a separate review of that book in another video. But the chapter that I think is interesting is the one that's lead with context, not control. This is a direct quote from that book. If your focus is on eliminating mistakes, lead with control. But if your goal is innovation, mistakes are not the primary risk. The big risk is becoming irrelevant because your people aren't coming up with the ideas to reinvent the business. I've been around leadership team meetings in companies where they are supposed to be innovative companies, but the most of the discussion and the focus and the energy is actually around the mistakes that are happening and trying to eliminate those. And I think that's a natural human behavior to focus on that rather than shift, disrupt, and change our thinking. So I find that a really interesting chapter to read on that I'd highly recommend. Leading with context is really different because it's about giving your people the information and the clarity of purpose and direction of where the company needs to go and their role within that. But then you're letting them get there however they think is best to do it. So it's a really empowering environment for your people. It's maybe a bit scary because they're going to be making decisions maybe without the normal frameworks of control that you'd find in organizations. But it's a wonderful example of giving them trust and then being able to hold them account to their own judgment. And that is a really empowering thing for people to go through in terms of self-development, etc. But it's great culturally from the context of innovation. Because if you imagine how to compete with something like status quo bias, this is a really good way to think about that. A great example of how leading with context and not control enables innovation in the Netflix story is Stranger Things, one of the most successful TV series ever released. If you think about Stranger Things on paper, it should never have worked. If there was a checklist or an approval process within a company that was looking at, right, for success we need big global appeal, big numbers, lots of people wanting to watch this thing, and you look at the criteria or the specifications of Stranger Things, is it aimed at teens? Is it aimed at adults? Is it scary? Is it a bit spoofy? Is it a nostalgic hit? Does it appeal to just people that were a certain age in the 80s? On paper, it should never have worked, but it did. Now, behind Netflix's decision to invest all that money in Stranger Things and their ultimate success, there were probably lots and lots of others that weren't a success, that were mistakes, but they were learned from quickly, and those mistakes guide them to situations where they can make massively successful decisions like Stranger Things. One of the things that's not talked about much in the book, but I think is really key in terms of this how to lead with context, not control, is the role of psychological safety. You need people to be able to be willing to take a risk, and therefore they need that level of psychological safety that makes that safe for them to do so. They have to be able to admit mistakes. In the Netflix book, they talk about spotlighting the mistake. So when you make a mistake, you spotlight it, you stand up or you broadcast, this is the mistake I made, this is what I've learned from it. And thirdly, you need to be able to be really openly able to talk about your mistake and feel comfortable with owning that, being accountable to that, and helping others to learn from it. So psychological safety is absolutely key in enabling this leading with context, not control. So in summary, what do we learn from this story of Blockbuster and Netflix from a cultural perspective in the workplace? For me, there are 3 questions that you can go and ask yourselves now about your own organization. The first, check your bias in your decision making. Think back to the last leadership team meeting that you had. What were the biases that you saw? We mentioned a few of those earlier on in the video. There are about 29 that exist in the average boardroom today, and I'll share the link in this video to explain what those things are. They are absolutely natural, but there are really good strategies that you can counter to those biases to improve decision making within organizations. 2, how do you lead? So very much focusing on this, do you lead with context or do you lead with control? And think about what's the purpose of your company? Is it innovation? Is it reducing mistakes? And therefore, what leadership style should you have to enable that direction? And then thirdly, do you have the level of psychological safety that is absolutely key for your company to have if it does need to disrupt, to innovate, to challenge the status quo and to do things differently? Do you have the right level of psychological safety to enable you to do that? So thank you for watching. I'm really keen to see any comments that anybody has on any of this content. Please like and subscribe to the channel if you want to know more.